Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for the session. I know it's toward the end of the day, so really appreciate your attendance. Today's session is called Social Access of Housing, Mapping New York City Affordable Housing Gap. I'd like to very briefly introduce our panelists. Enith is the founder and executive director of the Reparations Finance Lab. Rene Hamilton is the managing director of Helmsley, and MacMillan is a researcher at the Redress Unit. I'm David Scatterday. I'm in a moderate discussion, and I'm the managing director of Scatterday Associates, data analytics company. So I'd like to very, very briefly tie off on like 5 key points we're going to cover today. What you're going to learn and what our panel and data will show is, New York City is truly a highly unequal, segregated urban space. The chronic affordable housing crisis that currently is in the city really isn't being addressed by the current policy toolset. And especially the signature affordable housing programs that are currently in place historically and from the previous mayoral administration, may not only are not solving the current crisis, but may be exacerbating equity disparities that exist. We think of open data and open data economy as a really critical element of intersectional initiatives to really solve for this crisis. And we believe and will discuss and propose solutions that are truly intersectional, large scale, and must be focused on equity and access to drive true affordability in New York. So, and if I'd love to pass this over to you to just really anchor us in this discussion around kind of harm, repair, and affordable housing in New York City.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming again. So at the Reparations Finance Lab, we anchor our work in the historical racialized harm to Black people and in having a conversation around what repair and equity looks like for this traditionally excluded group, going back to the foundation of America. And so when we examine harm, we want to anchor a conversation in data and understanding where we're coming from, where we are, and use that to drive our design of reparative capital. How do we use an impact capital model to deliver reparative equity in the modern framework? Housing is really an important place because, as we know, housing is fundamental. It's also one of the places, both access to housing, access to land, access to belonging, that harm has been centralized to Black people in this country. So our framework is data-driven, narrative-led. So we tell the story around racialized harm, but we anchor our work in data, in evidence, and use that to build frameworks for addressing and design of reparative economic tools.
Thank you. I think one of the things that we found through this research initiative is that there's kind of a gap between the broader kind of civic dialogue around this issue and what may be happening, right? I think we're all aware of major, action at the city level around driving increased equity, but we see that, historical discriminatory activity continues to drive inequality in the built spaces around the city. New York is really facing an entrenched and seemingly unsolvable affordable housing crisis. But when we look into the toolbox that the city had at its disposal, these primary incentive structures and policies are broadly misaligned with the needs of the most vulnerable at-risk populations of the city, and those that have been that live in areas that have been historically disinvested and the target of discriminatory activity. And what's so interesting as well, we find as a phenomena, is that these issues are very much understood and discussed in silos, right, as fully kind of parallel conversations, whereas in reality, they're highly intersectional and, unknown misincentives in the tool set actually, are driving or possibly exacerbating these issues of inequality and access to opportunity and resources in these communities. So, Bo is at the Redress movement, who does deep narrative research on discrimination in urban spaces. And I think he's going to lead us to a case study of public housing in New York to really kind of anchor us in a light scenario of how this unravel to New York, or how this happened.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, David. So I guess I wanted to talk about New York City public housing, and specifically New York City public housing when it was first started. So NYC just started in the mid-1930s, because it was started in response to a similar but slightly tweaked problem for what we have today. So the reason that NYC was started, if we're thinking about housing affordability, is two levers. One is income, the other is the scarcity of the housing supply. If there's a lot of housing and not a lot of people who want it, you can't charge as much. If there's any amount of housing but people's incomes aren't that high, it will be expensive to them relative to what they're bringing into the home. So public housing started in New York City in the 1930s, and I put this quote up. Basically, Langdon Post was acknowledging that the private market could not serve a lot of New Yorkers because of the Great Depression at the time. The government had to intervene to build housing. I wanted to talk about Harlem housing in particular, though, because what happens in Harlem is a doubled sort of scarcity. So one, Great Depression slows down all construction in New York City. It basically at a standstill, and there's people pouring into the city hoping to find work for the Depression. And then in Harlem, you have this additional factor where anyone who is Black in the city is pretty much forced to live in Harlem. There's also some pockets in Queens and Brooklyn as well, but really they're forced to live in Harlem. So Harlem, relative to the housing you were getting, you were paying 20 to 50% more than anywhere else in the city. It had the most dire need for public housing, and so what's also interesting to me about the push to get it built there was that no landlord wanted to give up their land. The scarcity was great for them. They literally, we have it in NYC documents in the 1930s where they say, you can't condemn this land because it is the most valuable land in the city. We can charge the people on this land whatever we want because they can't go anywhere else. So, there's a different narrative of public housing that has since emerged as like it was an inherent failure, which I think we can have a different argument about funding and whatnot. But I think when we're thinking about housing and the two levers, I really like this example of public housing, particularly in the 1930s, because it was trying to address both things at once. We're going to subsidize the fact that people's incomes aren't high enough, and we're also going to try to create more housing supply. At the time, you couldn't clear housing to build public housing. You just had to build it on vacant land. We're going to try to add more supply to hopefully dampen down the market a little bit. So I just wanted to kind of keep those two levers in mind as we transition to more of what the problem is today and to think about the context in which they're occurring. So as history shows, New York City is unique among U.S. cities in that it's very much dominated by tenants. The land values are really expensive because it's been a historically really dense place. The other thing is that we actually, like David said earlier, we have a really, really robust system of housing affordability programs that has been true forever. We're one of the only city in the country that had both city, state, and federal public housing programs. They all came under one umbrella at NYC, but we had three. The other thing, and at work, I'm going to talk about this a little more with point 5, and we'll talk about it later in the presentation, is that we have really strong community influence over how development happens here, which happened as a response to Robert Moses. I'm going to throw a provocative quote out there, which was a public housing historian once said that Robert Moses integrated New York more than anyone else in the city's history, because we would not, I would venture to say this would be the most segregated city in the U.S. if we did not have public housing. Most of the neighborhoods that are integrated in New York City are neighborhoods that have public housing. If you took that away, I can't say that would stand. The fourth thing, which I mentioned earlier, New York has had a chronic housing shortage for literally as long as anyone can remember. Pick a decade, look at a newspaper, it's there probably. But I also think it's important if we're thinking about the levers of affordability. There's a general housing shortage right now, very similar to the 1930s. And there's a secondary housing shortage, which is even more acute for affordable housing because people's incomes have not risen anywhere near the cost of housing. And so this brings me to the last point, which we'll get to talk more about later in the presentation about how reparation finance-led tools can help address racial inequality in the city. So a lot of people conceptualize Mayor Bloomberg as the person that made skyscrapers happen, or a lot more of them in the 2010s. And I think an important fact to remember is that when Bloomberg rezoned the city, he rezoned 20% of the city, but the majority of rezonings were downzonings, aka enforced scarcity, cannot build. The other thing about those downzonings that I think is worth mentioning is that the majority of the downzonings happened in higher opportunity neighborhoods, mostly white neighborhoods with more homeowners, neighborhoods with people of higher income. So New York City, people want to move here. Just because you stop building does not mean people won't come. What happens when a flood hits an area, one part's added off, the other you're digging a hole deeper so that investment can go there. You're flooding that area in particular rather than spreading the investment out. And so you have crazy rent spikes in those areas. So that is in terms of New York City's unique history, but kind of what I wanted to lay out before. They spoke a lot more about Reparation Finance Labs tool. And yeah, I'll hope to talk more about it later in the panel.
Thank you, bro. You know, what I'll do now is go through some numbers and kind of rationalize where we are in the crisis itself as it relates specifically to the key kind of signature program for affordability in New York City, 418, 421A, and mandatory clean housing. And so I think this is, you know, we've all kind of spoken to this, and we probably all inherently experienced it as residents of New York, but the crisis is profound. A few data points are on the screen that I won't necessarily read out loud, but a few that really stand out. The rent to income ratio, according to Moody's, last year was 68.5. So on average across the city, 68.5 of disposable income or income was dedicated to some kind of housing outlet. And, you know, the rent burden, scenario really played out in pernicious way. Today, we have over 70,000 people that sleep in New York City shelter system, and that number is expected to increase dramatically as the moratorium and emergency rental assistance programs expire. And of course, the median rent in the two largest boroughs in terms of population, you know, really skyrockets to thresholds that are beyond unaffordable. So there's a lot of data here, but I think that kind of shows kind of the extreme chronic nature of the crisis at this moment.
Sorry.
And
Sorry, can you just go back and say which we can't see the name with the
sure.
which coloring are?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Every time. So the top blue line is Manhattan. The second line, the orange line is Brooklyn. The third line, the green line is Queens. The Bronx is, the pink kind of maroonish line is the Bronx, and the bottom line, the lowest average median asking rent by borough is Staten Island. So 30 seconds or less on AMI. This may be, if you're in housing or interested in housing, you're probably aware of this metric, but this is average median housing published every year by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is really a key eligibility threshold that's used in programs around the country for affordability and access to employment. And so published last year, just also reference what based off of your own lived scenario, these are the bands and thresholds as calculated by HUD. So to be extremely low income, you cannot meet more than $36,000 a year for a family of two people. But let's just sit with that and think about what that means, right? And the average at about 100% is moving around 100,000. So that also gives you a quick math data points, kind of go through some of the program thresholds.
And I'd just also say there, HUD's defining low income and very low income as they don't want your housing costs to exceed 30% of your income.
And we now know that about 68% of cost for housing in New York City on average in 2022. So extremely low and very low, cap out at 60,000. And, you know, as we can see, these are extremely outlier income groups. So 421A is really kind of the grandfather of affordable housing programs, and it has really evolved significantly in almost 50 years since it was founded in 1971. It's really kind of started as a incentive to bring in-migration of middle-class families to New York. And it's kind of evolved over time in its most significant iteration in 2017 as Affordable New York program that really kind of tightened affordability thresholds of AMI for developers to get access to the tax incentive. It lapsed in June of last year and is up for reevaluation at the state level with significant, with kind of some significant reconfiguration by Governor Hochul. What we've seen very much is that while this has been in place, the data shows that while it's driven the creation of that new inventory, will kind of very quickly pivot to its kind of impact in terms of target audience and investment population. So just so you can see, there's kind of different flavors of the program. And at the end of the day, they range from, the benefits are, you can go from about 10% of AMI in certain options all the way to 130%, right? So we use that 100,000 as a 100%. Families can be eligible for this affordable housing, making up to over $100,000 a year for a family. So this one is just kind of where we thought was an incredible, not mic drop, but just really showed the misalignment of the program and its impacts in terms of who it's affecting. In New York, the population, the percent of the population that are rent-furnished, aka meet those thresholds of the percentage of income bound housing, the vast majority are extremely low income, right? Which that threshold is 30,000. But if we look at the share and beginnings that were created by this program and the way that they've been marketing to and consumers, only 1.5% have been targeted to families in those specials, right? So essentially what this data really shows is that we've used massive tax dollars to incentivize private development of housing for middle income and middle upper income New York families. And this is it's kind of gotten worse over time. So this is analysis that was done by NYC Furring Center that shows housing that were units that were marketed under this program, where they fell in terms of AMI bands for eligibility. In the earlier cohort of 2016 to 2018, there was a bit of a skew, but leaned toward the lower end of the income spectrum, with the majority of the 60% threshold. In the last 2 years, recently at 2021, the vast majority were marketed nearly 90% to the 130% of via the NYC Housing Connect website, which is just, mind-blowing when we think about the effectiveness of this program and serving deeply, rent-furnished families in the lowest income band. So the second program that we're going to look at, and apologies for running so fast, I think we want to anchor most of our discussion around data solution. We just wanted to give us what the current state looks like. MIH was Mayor de Blasio's kind of signature housing program. It really requires inclusionary for affordable housing for any developments that occur because of rezoning upzone in terms of FAR or floor ratios, in terms of higher density, right? And so what we're seeing is these required levels they're slightly tighter, but very closely mapped to the 421 threshold, right? So in many cases, in upzone requirements, developers can double it and get both incentives at once, right? While meeting very similar eligibility thresholds. And when it's looked comparatively against other inclusionary housing programs in major DMAs or major metropolises out in the country, we're regressive in terms of the targets or income that compared to other cities. So in New York, you can create affordable housing for families that go up to 102%. And we're the latest of all of these comparator cities, right? So we're less liberal and more friendly to private developers in the design elements of the affordability profile. And this is a case study that was created for a mixed development in Gowanus. There was a rezoning initiative in 2018. And the pro forma projection that really anchors us in what the impact of this program is as well. So this is a 100,000 square foot development with about 100. It's a nice year-round members to play with. And they're complying with option 1 of the MIH program, which requires that 25% meet that MIH threshold for that building, right? And you're able to create a composite band, 40% AMI for 8 units, 60% AMI for 9 units, and 80% AMI for the remaining units, 2 units at 25. If we go back to the thresholds from HUD in terms of deep before the, deep, very low income, out of these 10 units, out of these 25 units, only 6 actually are eligible for families in those highly rent burdened or very low income bands. So we're creating massive subsidies, 100 bedroom units, and only 6 actually go to deeply rent burdened bands, unlimited. So less than a single digit percentage of inventory. So that for us is there in terms of the affordability tool set for New York City. And if I want to pass it over to you to talk about this kind of very had groundbreaking construct around standardized measurement for social access as defined by our.
Yeah, so thanks, David. So when we're having a conversation around reparative work for historically marginalized communities, we take a look at communities as they are, and the first part of our conversation and our thinking is, what does a healthy, sustaining community look like? What are the social assets in that community? And the other side is, what are the assets that are missing? And we, I think as New Yorkers, we kind of intuitively understand that more middle class, wealthy communities have much more present social capital and less, and historically and racially, right? Disadvantaged communities have those. And we thought it was important for our fellow for Reparations Finance Lab to understand if, as we think about designing the new capital tools to bring capital into communities, that we want to be targeted and ensure that the design and the application of the capital will be going to those communities that have the most need. And so the need, in some communities, we work in, we have done work in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's very clear, right? That harm is very clear. You look, there are other communities where you have the presentations through redlining or through restrictive covenant. New York is just a very different animal, right? As Bo spoke about, historically, a renters community, very rigid and enduring lines of settlement and residence. And if you are then looking to repair those communities, you have to understand what's missing. And so we've created a map that looks at a variety of metrics around things like education and health, involvement, criminal justice, just to get a good baseline read of the community. And then that would provide us the basis to create a conversation between public, private, and philanthropic capital about really impacting deeply on these communities.
And what we've come up with is the composite index that has these 4 categories. And then I'd love for you to just kind of give some more color into why these, why we think these indicators or metrics themselves kind of are proxies for these social access and social equity conditions with these local.
Yeah, so, with housing, again, we've spoken about it. It's around the question of, is it affordable, right? And in New York, the definition of affordable is really important because it is so highly rent burdened and also so many people rent, right? Is it sufficient? We know that part of being rent burdened is that people are also crowded in New York City apartments, right? It's just, it's an environment where you sort of get a room and you stay there because it's of the scarcity. And going to the stability of the housing stock, is there an option for additional housing? Is there an option for you to move from one space to another? With education, we want to measure the foundational impact of a good educational on families' ultimate sort of success is so important. But many communities, again, who live in places that have historic levels of segregation and racial harm, do not always have very good access to education, right? It's overcrowded. It's all of the things that we know are not conducive to very good educational outcomes. And with that, we measure the data that just tracks, high school graduates, graduation rates, access, the presence of college graduates, because those things tell us something about the communities. We also look at the health of of the community, and it's both the health of the individuals, but also of the community, including environmental health. We look at the access to health centers, but we also look at, do you have green space, right, for physical activity? Is it safe, right? Is there a history of environmental harm in that community? That's important to note, because we know that also becomes something that you would then build in for your repair. And then we also look at this component that's called wealth enablement. And that is, within those communities, are there opportunities for individuals to build wealth? And one of the known outgrowths from redlining is that not only were communities deprived of mortgages and the opportunity for individual homeowners, but because of the decisions around redlining, you also had private capital not coming into those communities. Again, in New York, you're not necessarily looking at redlining, but you're looking at really rigid settlement and housing immobility, and those communities are therefore not having the elements for building wealth, which includes, formal capital, right? Like banks and financial institutions, right? Those are impediments to health, right? And to wealth accumulation. Criminal justice. We know that one element of a good life or a comfortable life is a safe streets, right? We also know that in New York City, there's a particular history of policing and how it interacts, and how policing interacts with poorer communities. We want to take a look at that. And then civic engagement. Civic engagement in New York overwhelmingly tends to be from the most resourced communities and those who are seeking to preserve frantic privilege. Those communities that could actually benefit from civic engagement in articulating their needs, you find that you don't have the same level of participation, right? And as you build this multi-layered map of these communities that are distressed and that are ready for and reparative action, you find it's a layering on of harm.
So I'll give a quick demo of the tool itself, and really surrounding the tool, I want to really name this as a product of the open data economy. So what we've done is created essentially a mapping table that takes data from multiple locations, inclusive of New York City open data, formal, but also the American Community Survey of the Census Bureau, other kind of federal agencies like EPA, the Department of Labor, and it kind of standardize these to the track level, which we think is like the right data resolution for us to help inform advocacy, policy development, and further research. We're able to understand kind of community dynamic of being too micro or too macro. And use this conversation with you all as a criminal call to action to please provide feedback, support, or otherwise engage with kind of building a tool that's robust enough to provide a diagnostic tool to drive an equity-based policy, right? Which is, I think, why we're all probably here today. Yes, very quick move. So it's a web-based tool, and it'll be available to all participants, or School of Data or New York City Open Data Week. And what we did is we broke it down at the census tract level, which you see here. And for each tract, we provide the NTA, the area population area, provide the borough location, and the value or score for either composite all-in help, access score. Or we also enable the users to look at kind of sub-component scores of different areas. And let's take a look at housing, right? And so you looking at those indicators that, and at the actual sub-indicators that drive the score for the category, we kind of see very clearly that, in some outer borough areas that do have lower density and higher incomes, we see some high scores. Commercial, where you kind of expect there to be broad housing with lower rate with lower density rates at the unit level and affordability broadly mapped to our expectation rate. And we were like, what are, and what's very interesting is we can overlay things that we think matter most in terms of the policy space we're discussing, right? So in terms of historically disinvested community, with the goal of creating nodes of opportunity, access to wealth, we see things like this in the wealth enablement score, that these areas of wealthier, mid to low density in mid and lower Manhattan provide access to those spaces, right? So it's very much proxy of what we understand the kind of conditioning and environment of our built space to be. And we see a lot of this investment in these historic views that call it like Flatbush, East New York, Brownsville, Sunset at Fallon, Sunset Park, et cetera, right? And so what we've done is create kind of hopefully a shared vocabulary for folks that are intersectional and caring about equity and access as the first principle, and research and policy design to have a dynamic real-time location to be able to look at what the condition of the built space is, right? From a peer-reviewed methodology underlying these scores. And, I think just from this discussion with this working group that's presenting today, what we also think of it as this also a great kind of foundation infrastructure for other overlays that drive also really interesting discussions. So, for example, Bo mentioned, hey, NYC housing is actually this kind of two-edged sword in that, may reinforce certain types of disparities in terms of access, but does force racial spatial integration, right? And let's take a look at where NYC properties are. So New York Open Data Portal has a shapefile and overlay for these properties, right? So we're able to click on this, and then we see, the properties and their geographic footprints across the 5 boroughs. And then we're able to see, places that have high scores, like we said, actually map strongly to the vast majority of inventory of affordable housing as created by, these state and federal and city affordable housing programs or subsidized public housing programs. So we've already created in our advocacy tool set a lot of use cases for the use of the tool. We want to disseminate that more broadly and look at how we community in New York that's really interested in this issue. Then more importantly, we kind of use from the portal, all the data around the impact of this program, right? So if we want to take a look at NIH, de Blasio's program roughly went into existence in 2016. So I think let's say we could put in Jan 1 2017 to present day, and then we looked at all those options, right? And let's say we want to look at deep affordability with option 1, which had kind of the loosest threshold. We could analyze, but what we see when we do this is the active incentive structures for the public developers play out in time and place, right? So we see that they're either going to build nodes of high commercial value and economic activity, aka accents, or in some cases, if they're able to get enough upzoning density because of community board disinvolvement or other incentives like that, they will actually build limited inventory in these historically disinvested communities. But what we're seeing is a reinforcement of the profit maximizing incentive that the developer has in the way and place that they choose to develop, right? And so now we have this very kind of perverse private sector friendly incentive structure mapped out around a baseline and vocabulary around disinvestment and access and equity, right? We think that this, again, can be a great way to drive these productive discussions with policymakers and advocates. So again, we'll share this as a leave behind, forwarding the nodes, the URL to this portal, which is open for entry for all public access. Okay, so I want to pass the baton back to our very esteemed panel. I think you heard basically the last for you today, and walk us through the key takeaways that we've seen and these kind of radical transformational and intersectional policy recommendations that have been brought together by this intersectional group of panelists.
And I think as we do that, I'm going to ask Rene, who actually represents the private sector, to if you could sort of just reflect on what you've heard and share with us where you think there are opportunities for, hate the term win-win, but there are opportunities for a different outcome. And as we do that, I would like to invite Sumner, who is also a part of the Redress movement, to join us because he'll be part of our discussion. And for those of you who don't know, the Redress movement came out of Richard Brockstein's very important work, The Color of Law, that looked at the way in which, you should tell them.
Richard Brockstein's book looked at how the federal government participated in the way that America is segregated. At the Redress movement, we're trying to help local communities understand that, or help them understand and empower them to advocate the changes that they want, because even though segregation has national patterns, it's very local in terms of how it plays out. And so our goal is to help local communities figure out, like, how do these national patterns apply here, and therefore what's the type of policies that we would need to redress segregation based off our history.
And so Sumner and Bo are both there. So Rene?
So, responding to some of the data presented today and looking at the productivity of some of the development incentives, what really stood out to me was just how little actual truly affordable housing stock has gotten created over the last 30 years in New York City. And anecdotally, when you speak with developers, typically two things happen. A, you have developers who have, enough capital to just not participate in, programs that are aimed at providing more affordable units in New York. They opt out. So there's a large opt-out effect. Or B, developers who do participate in this system take a very long time to develop the capital stack required to participate in the programs that do deliver these units. And so to get to truly affordable units, you're logged by the requirements of the various programs to access, whether it's the tax credits through low-income tax credits or low-income housing tax credits, or you're trying to access development dollars, that are willing to, look at programs and maybe not get the rent increases that affordable, market rate developments are able to accomplish. And so, it's a real challenge, and you see this played out in the lives of New Yorkers and many developers. They're frustrated by the sort of current system. Now, something that could potentially change this dynamic that we've sort of discussed, if we had our own magic wand, would be if you could experiment with ways to, fast track affordable development. If a developer were to guarantee a certain number of affordable units in a project, and in that way, potentially using the additional FAR as an incentive to developing additional affordable units, so that in some measure, a developer isn't going to have to rely solely on tax credits or, a city or state program to accomplish their goal. Something else that we haven't really spoken a lot about, but could be part of the solution, is if, the city and state were more focused on home ownership programs, right? Because ownership could also be a lever that the government uses to sort of alleviate some of the demand on the rental market, right? Frankly, we have people who rent for much longer than they should. And if there were affordable home ownership programs, you could shift people, hopefully not giving them owners, mortgage burdens, right? But there are programs that could assist with, down payment, or there are other programs, whether through NACA or some other sources, you could potentially have more of a sort of flexible ecosystem between renters and owners to alleviate the demand on the housing stock for rental units in New York City, and really fostering more of an interplay between New York City and its sort of suburbs, many of which are becoming more increasingly Black and minority. And so there could be some positive benefits from, supporting, upstate, downstate strategy that looks at renters and home ownership as a potential lever.
What you've just said, and I want to ask, Bo, if you could just take a quick spin through AFHR and just identify that's another possible lever.
Oh yeah, definitely. I was actually going to ask, just as a preface for this, Sumner, so Sumner interacts with a lot of the people that are interested in the Redress movement digitally, and I was going to say, like, a rough profile, like, would you say that people are city, suburbs, and thinking about both at the same time? Like, do they see the tensions as between the two, or is it just kind of a more national pattern? And when people talk to you,
I would certainly say it's a national pattern.
Yeah.
As I come here as a community organizer, and I use digital tools to communicate to these folks and convey the narrative of how segregated, or how their community came to be segregated, which is why this index I find to be a very specific tool in that regard. And I think that this is something that could be communicated nationally.
Yeah.
In that way, if that's what your intent is.
Yes, and I guess when people think about the scale of fair housing, they're like, we passed a fair housing policy, that's that. We stopped discrimination. But our director of field organizing, I think he at a Charlotte City Council meeting, he had this amazing rebuttal to someone saying like, oh, changing zoning is just going to build housing that no one could live in. And he was like, there's three types of segregation. There's a history of segregation, there's the present reality of segregation, and there's segregation that does not have to exist in the future. And we have to take care of all three of those things at once. Zoning addresses the future one a lot, kind of helps with the present. There's other things that will do with past. And so AFFH, originally when we passed our Fair Housing Act, there's a provision called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, which not a lot of people know about, which was supposed to be the stick, or the heaviest stick in a bundle of sticks to stop housing discrimination, which was if your community did not allow integrated or affordable housing, the federal government would pull funds from it. It actually started under the Nixon administration with Mitt Romney's dad, George Romney, but people were so pissed off when he started using it that Nixon was like, we got to stop this guy. He's a maverick. George Romney was pushed out of the administration. AFFH died. It came back under the Obama administration. He didn't actually implement the policy, but asked communities to start gathering data. It was a pretty burdensome data gathering system, I would say. It phased out in the Trump administration, and the Biden administration actually just bought it back. They simplified data plans for AFFH, and they're working on what the sticks are going to be if a community doesn't follow through. So usually people think about AFFH as, we have to integrate the suburbs, which is true, although they kind of have been self-integrating to a degree because so many people have been pushed out of cities due to affordability issues. I think it would be interesting, and we've talked about this, of what does AFFH look like if you put it within New York City? We set a housing goal for how much housing we have to build, how much affordable housing, but every neighborhood has to put its fair share. All new development can't go in one. All of them have to do their share. What would it look like to carrot and stick that? Do you take away bike lanes? Do you not, fund dog parks much? I don't know, but it would be an interesting thing to see implemented in New York City.
Which, the dog parks are really a direct example of really great civic engagement, right? Engaged citizenry, and I think RFL, again, we are fundamentally around looking at capital and how do you direct capital into these conversations and mix it with policy to achieve different outcomes, right? But we are also very much grounded in understanding and mapping and documenting the harm so that we are not fixing on top of a problem, right? So you really have to be deeply evidence-based and understanding the local granularity to a street level, what it is that you're trying to fix, right? And then you invite in private capital. That there's a whole thesis at RFL about why private capital, those are the banks and international institutions that were very much drivers of segregation and inequity, need to come affirmatively. That's a loaded word, but come to the table to invest in fixing the problems that their own behaviors and actions actually, created the blueprint for. And so, Sumner, I think, as the community activist at the table, and we have met and had conversation. What would be your sort of, from the ground level, what do you think we should be looking at to communicate to communities about their possibilities and about their frustrations, to address them and to engage with them, even as we're working to engage with the other level, which is the capital allocators? What do you think for?
The redress movement kind of operates on the theory that the first step that we have to do is change the narrative around it. And connecting storytelling devices such as the index to community groups who are interested in having these conversations is the first step to mobilize, because we have to inspire, educate, and then mobilize.
Right.
And so the first step that we always take is to facilitate those kinds of conversations. Approach groups, different organizations, individuals, and really try to get committees and roundtables together where these kind of conversations can happen in productive and safe places.
Yeah, that's
So if I can,
we do have a hand, but we'll let you go. Yeah.
just one quickly, Bo asked a question about, where can we look, how can you use AFFH as a, maybe not a stick, but a sort of prod and kernel.
Yeah.
And in New York, I think there's, also due to some of the data that exists, New York City neighborhoods are divided into bids, and these bids are a very powerful source of information on demographics and economic activity and advocacy in communities. And so I think that might be one potential space of partnership, thinking about how bids function. And as communities begin to do some advocacy work, bid is a often underutilized tool, but it's a space where, some of the economic activity that would be meaningful to this work is also being looked at.
That's important. Thank you for that. So we don't want to just be talking to ourselves. We're mindful of the time. So you're opening up for response. 10 minutes left. Yes, I see that. Yes. So there's a question.
Yeah, I think a couple of things came to mind. So seeing the figures about the AMI and such. So it was 32, it was about 30 something grand for a family of 3, right? So for the fares, just to think about transportation, it is actually under, right now it stands that you'd have to make under $28,000. I think it was 25 actually, for a family of 3 to be able to get half fare. So I mean, that's,
Wow.
So when we think, I think it's also, so that's something to think about, right? When we're thinking about equity and access, I'm what does that mean, transportation? And someone has to not paying any time over the last couple of years before I left the job that I just had, and I'm there with my kid, I'm not paying for each one, it's not happening. And and so thinking about those things, and when we think about those numbers, and when you talk about also the dark in the community, I think bringing the myths around these programs, right? Like the 421A, you'll hear in the news, we didn't get this project. Oh my God, we have to get this project back on in order to make sure that developers have. It's bullshit. Developers will come if they want to, right? But so I think that's a really important thing. I'm very curious. I don't think you'll have an answer for this one in particular, but for example, the project in Harlem. I wonder, the project in Harlem that did happen in Richard Jackson's district, right? If it did happen, this negotiation began, how either there will be talking about those projects, we break down and actually be what will actually happen? And also, if you were to look at the stock of these projects that have received these abatements, right? these 30, many of them might be cutting on those 30 years. Where are we about to lose out? So I think a lot about how do we visualize that and put that out? And then also, what does it mean when you're having any project in 30 years? What does it, my mom's been living in the same apartment. We've been, and I've been in and out of that apartment for the past 30 plus years, right? What would happen is that like, that goes away, not cleaning the program. So I think it's talking about those granular things in how do they affect that person in that moment. Like if we give 30 years, what does that mean if this program goes away? 30 years is just over a generation. And if you're not able to lead into household to become an owner, what does that mean? And I think also in thinking about like the things that you talked about, I would say is like, are these people with student loans, right? Like I'm someone who's had an education, how about we think, but like student loan burdens, like what are other factors that might, my mom is on screen. What does it mean for those communities? And when we're talking about the communities that we want to build and build multi-generational, so what are the communities that live in? What are the ones that aren't free from rent? What are the ones that have to rely on going to senior centers for meals? I think those are some important aspects to think about. I feel the kind of neighborhood we want to think, like what are the kinds of neighborhoods we want to build? Is it just that I want access to like luxury, or is it that I want to like build community and like no neighbor because there's craziest to me and such? But I think those are some of the things that I think about when what are we talking about and what's going to come of it. And then all these proposals, like there's the proposals about the FAR, right? If you do this one with the FAR, if you convert this space, I think that'll be really important in be figuring out how we visualize the different outcomes, because there's a lot between the mayor's office, the speaker, and the legislature, and the governor.
Yeah.
How do you line up one go to like actually visualize what that means?
One of my big takeaways just from this entire exercise is that, we're in desperate need of highly consumable policy effectiveness tools, right? So we understand the trade-offs that are happening with our tax dollars, right? In terms of outcomes that we care about as a community, right? And so if we just take that Gowanus case study as an example, and, we say, we're giving, and just as a hypothetical, we do $15 million in tax credits to this developer, and we're creating 6 units for, very low income families, we know there's 70,000 people that are unhoused every night, right? Is that, $25 million with the highest and best trade optimal use, just to use a policy term, just all affordable housing? Maybe that and not great, for
like what do we build around that, right? Like then you get these units, and every supermarket, everything that's built around it it's not for those.
It's not for the right.
With the bread level. So then, where do they go to get their coffee or any?
Right. So something we sort of talked about to that last point is, how could there be a model where there's subsidized retail, or thinking about ways to keep retail rents affordable? Because one reason you gave that pretty much private real estate operator hat on is when a property has, or units that are subsidized through programs, those rental units aren't going to see rent appreciations at a market level, perhaps. But what the developer would then try to do is to maximize their rents on the retail. And so I'm working on a project I've shared with this group in Brooklyn that was an EDC project and New York Economic Development Committee. And while we've been approached by operators of daycares, which would be great for the community and a great use, the pro forma rent that's required is much higher than the types of services many of that community need. And so you do have this disconnect.
And I think this is where we introduce our radical, transformative model of capital, right? Because at the end of the day, it comes down to the capital that the community doesn't have, right? And the capital, one of the challenges with being rent burdened is you're not able to accumulate wealth, right? Because you're just putting it all in one direction. It's not even meeting your need. We're thinking to be truly transformative and at scale, we actually have to create funding mechanisms that have very different return profiles for private capital. So the current paradigm is a current sort of, commercial real estate capital stack, and there is the equity and put in your tax credits, and you have your various syndications, but everybody wants, and requires a certain return that's within the current paradigm. When we think through a reparative lens, and I just want us to, as we do this, think about what has happened with the market for climate and how we've created an alternative financing market around mitigation and adaptation of climate. What if we were to do a similar program around the deep need to historically address this issue and to also create opportunity for the entire city to grow and create just a brand new financing market, a different primary market with a secondary market to offtake, to push that capital through to create what we actually need. And so that's the radical transformative.
The other thing about the Parliament example is I think that's a great example about the thing I was talking about earlier with the manufactured scarcity.
Yeah.
So like that a lot of the development is being driven out of I think to start with this, people are moving to New York City. I think it's like in the last 2 or 3 decades, for every 4 jobs we created, we built 1 housing unit. That is the recipe for a crisis. And so the Bloomberg solution, which was we will downzone more neighborhoods that were upzoned, so we only increase residential capacity by 1.7%, which nowhere near what we needed. Basically, you're not stopping the flood, you're just redirecting it, and it's getting redirected into historic neighborhoods like Harlem. And I think the hard conversation that needs to be had is like, we do need to build housing, but it shouldn't all be being built in these neighborhoods. I think it would look different. Let me put it this way. The Harlem project, if it was like, we build this huge thing, but also we built an equally large building with even more affordability in Park Slope, it would look way different if that was like the side by side.
We have time for one year last. There are 2. Okay, so may I take her and then I'll take it? Okay, yes.
Yeah, I really like this presentation, and I really work with it with this is far from between our incentives process, but actually happen. And I don't think we call the question like, well, how did this happen in the first place? I understand the policy and the sort of history that went into the happen. But then I started thinking back, how do we what is the root cause that made this happen in the first place? And I feel like we have voters, and then we have our representatives who actually put policy in action. I understand that your index and your scoring, which I also very technically, first of all, how you come close over the full out there. So I understand that it's going to be mostly helpful for the representatives. I wondered if you have any sort of approach more at the community level, and maybe the other communities having right now, if you company or do arms with our community. I don't like being possibly evert or something like that. What are your approach with all the more people on the ground who are often been this abused?
Very good point. And I think it's part of our sort of model of engagement. While we are the tool that we choose to focus on is capital, we understand it doesn't operate in a silo, right? And we actually think it's part of the siloing of conversations and actors, stakeholders, why we have gotten this just lopsided outcome from what we're just not solving what it is that we say. So absolutely, there's
honestly, if you guys have any problems right now, folks.
So the direct answer is we do not have a real community outreach engagement, which is what we do are partnerships. And so where we are getting that input is through our partnership with Redress Network, but also our partnership with the Reparations movement, which is not just a national but international conversation, because reparations is a very specific, focused action to repair the historic harm of racialized, economic, psychological, physical, discrimination and harm against Black people. So that's really where our grounding is. I think we have one question, and I would like to work with. Okay, one.
It's a question. Is the methodology for creating the indices in the public domain?
No, but it's in this deck. We have it as a kind of appendix in the deck. So we'll share it out with the group, and it'll be in there. And, I kind of designed the methodology behind it and would love to have any conversation with statisticians, data scientists. I think the ultimate goal is to make it fully open source and customizable weighting for any given input to support any scenario.
Awesome.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Very briefly, if I may, I'd like to say that the Redress movement's hosting a webinar on March 27th, specifically about research for repair, how we're using this type of data, this type of research to really inform local campaigns as well as eventually national.
Recording stopped.
Have a website sign-up form here if you're interested.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But all the that thing show what the road effect were the bad, right?